The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Abraham and Isaac. So these videos are intended to be useful to almost anybody who would like an understanding of a subject that they don't have or a different perspective. We're all individuals and there are lots of different views on the best way to argue or discuss certain topics. The Atheist Debates project covers debates, debate reviews, standard arguments for the existence of God, some arguments against the existence of particular definitions of gods, interviews, and a series of Bible studies. I started with the Sermon on the Mount, and today we're going to be looking at the story of Abraham and Isaac. But before I start, one of the questions that I get from time to time is, why do you bother going into so much detail on these subjects? For example, I just released a video not too long ago about C.S. Lewis's Liar, Lunatic, or Lord. Now, that video could have been maybe 20, 30 seconds. Hi, there's a fourth option. It's legend. We've heard it before. But that doesn't tend to serve anyone as far as giving them an understanding of the subject. And I have to tell you that believers see that as just dismissive. Oh, you've never actually really considered this issue. And so it's worthwhile to go through, what are the options? Liar, is it preposterous that he could have been a liar, or that someone might have lied on his behalf? Is it even, do we have even good reason to believe that he existed? So we had to cover a little bit about the possibility of mythicism, which we'll talk about in greater detail in future videos. And despite including content to cover the three options presented plus legend, there were still things that were left out of there. Almost immediately, people pointed out that C.S. Lewis's primary foundation, that it is impossible to just consider him a good moral teacher, is in fact false. Now, I try to cover this a little bit by pointing out that even if somebody has a strong delusion, they may be lucid from time to time. But I don't think I addressed it fairly. I don't think I addressed it fully. The thing to take away is that this is C.S. Lewis engaged in sort of all or nothing thinking. That the entirety of everything ever attributed to Jesus must be good in order for us to say, oh, he's a good moral teacher. Well, really, then he's equating good with perfect. He must have been a perfect moral teacher in order for it to have any benefit. When the truth is, as I pointed out in the Sermon on the Mount video, there are things attributed to Jesus that were good advice, that were good moral teachings, and other things that we can view as not. And you might be able to look at him and say, in general, he's a good moral teacher, but not in total. And that's not a problem. So there's always one more aspect to consider. And as we go through this story of Abraham and Isaac, many of you will have heard me speak about this before, either on the show or in a lecture, but I want it in kind of one condensed package here. This is the root of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. This story of the binding of Isaac has been popular in art and history. It is the test that allowed God, or that was the foundation upon which God made a covenant that built the Jewish people. It is this confusion about which son was potentially offered up as a sacrifice, and the conflict between Isaac and Ishmael that becomes a divergent point that is where we get Islam from. And Christianity, of course, is an extension of Jewish tradition. The idea that there's a Messiah coming. Although, if you ask the Jews whether or not Jesus was the Messiah, they'll say no. And that's why we've jokingly said before that atheists really haven't had to do a lot of work. If you want to find out what's wrong with Christianity, you can ask a Jew. If you want to find out what's wrong with Islam, you can ask a Christian. If everybody else is pointing out the flaws in all these other religions, and the non-believers are the ones that are saying, we agree with you. None of you have made your burden of proof. None of you have a case. I don't understand how you can so clearly see the flaws in religions that aren't yours and yet fail to see the flaws that are in yours. So while this may be more detail than some people are interested in, it's also significantly less detail than others are interested in hearing and in understanding. But the thing is, if you're a fundamentalist in particular, you are raised with these stories. You are raised often with not even correct biblical views about these stories. Your preacher, in an attempt to soften the narrative or to create a moral conclusion or some sort of guidance, to draw guidance from the story, may depart from the text a bit. And in response to people saying, I'm not sure I understand this, you're saying that God, who we think is opposed to child sacrifice, asked Abraham to kill his own son as a test. There's a lot of confusion there, and there are a lot of apologetic responses. So let's take a look from the King James Version at what the Bible actually says about the binding of Isaac and the offering of him as a sacrifice. So the story of Abraham's binding of Isaac begins in Genesis chapter 22 at verse 1. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. Now, that's the first 5 verses of this story, but there's some backstory to cover pretty briefly. God had made a covenant with Abraham that, his children would be his favorite children and, number amongst the stars, etc. But Abraham's wife, Sarah, was barren, hadn't had any children. She was 75 years old, according to the Bible at this point, and hadn't had any children at all. So Sarah offers her handmaiden, maid Hagar, to Abraham as yet another wife. Now, for all of the people talking about biblical marriage, it's one man, one woman, they clearly haven't read the Bible at all. Because at this time, you could have your wife, your wives, your maidservants, etc. But because Sarah was barren and they wanted to fulfill God's promise, I don't know why they wouldn't just trust God to fulfill his own promise. But they give Hagar to Abraham as a wife, and she bears him Ishmael, which is Abraham's firstborn. So in verse 1, it is God coming to tempt Abraham. But in telling him, hey, I want you to kill your son, he also says, your only son. Now, the language there says your only son, Isaac, but it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, your only son by Sarah, Isaac, or your son Isaac would have been enough, but only son. And that to me seems to have meaning in that this is the story as told by the Jews. And there's this contention over birthrights and Isaac and Ishmael, and Isaac is the father of the Jews. This is the tradition that begins from here. So they need to play him up as the only son. There are other people who say that this is a sort of a harbinger of what's to come when God offers up his only son, which would then make us ask the question, does God have another son from a handmaiden that he didn't offer up because he wasn't his first love son by his first wife? Who knows? But he tells him to take Isaac and go to a mountain, and there he's going to kill him. Isaac, with no discussion, there's nothing here at all where he seems to talk to Isaac or anything else. He just grabs 2 of his young men workers, gathers up all the stuff he needs, and heads off on a multi-day trek to find this mountain that God is going to point him towards. In verse 5, Abraham says to the 2 guys, hey, stay here with this ass. I'm going to take my son and we're going to go off and worship, and we'll come back later. There are apologists who will try to argue that this is a signal that Abraham does in fact know that he's not going to kill Isaac, that he has some knowledge that God is going to stop this. I'm not necessarily sure that that's the case. It seems to me reasonable that somebody who just grabbed them and took off on a trek might say something like, hey, we're going to go over here and be right back, because saying, I'm going to take my son up there and kill him might have gotten a slightly different response. Who knows? The story continues, beginning at verse 6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him upon the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. Now, when you listen to this story, there's no discussion of what must have clearly been, as many have pointed out, a traumatic experience for Isaac. You know, he's like, hey, we're going off to do a sacrifice, but I don't see a lamb around. And Abraham's, don't worry, God will provide something. Now, people will often look at that verse, verse 8, where Abraham says, God will provide a lamb, as another signal that Abraham knows that he's not actually going to kill Isaac and that God's going to provide some alternate sacrifice. If that's the case, then we have a clear example that this test seems to be rather useless. What is it that God is testing Abraham about? What is the purpose of this test? Well, we'll get into details in just a little bit about what God could be testing him on and who is actually being tested here. But Isaac is seized and bound and laid upon the altar, and Abraham takes his knife to slay him. It doesn't say anything about Isaac going into a sleep, although apologists will sometimes say that that's what happened, that clearly God in his mercy would not have wanted to traumatize Isaac, so he just kind of put him to sleep and laid him there. There's no evidence of that. That's a post hoc rationalization that is based on the idea that God couldn't have done something cruel. And yet it's being used as a sort of apology for a story that is absolutely cruel. What does it feel like to be told by the creator of the universe, who you think is telling you to do the right thing, that you need to kill your child? What does it feel like to be the child with your parent, and they are convinced that God has commanded them to kill you? The biblical version of this doesn't really talk about the son at all. But the Quran tells a slightly different story. In Surah 37, beginning at around verse 100, I think, to 113, the son in the story isn't named at all. But what Abraham does before he ever leaves, evidently, is he comes to his son and he says, hey, son, I've had a vision that I'm supposed to offer you as a sacrifice. And his son says, okay, that sounds good to me. Whatever God says must be good type of thing. Let's go ahead and sacrifice me or offer me up as a sacrifice. And they leave and head out. And just about the time that Abraham is going to kill his unnamed son, an angel stops them, or God stops them. The fact that the son is unnamed in the Quran gets back to this kind of confusion or conflict between Abraham's two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, Ishmael being the firstborn. So we have this situation, but what happens? God has decided to test Abraham, to have him kill his son, and we're at that moment. And then what happens? So we left off at verse 10, where Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham. And Abraham said, Here I am. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. It's interesting that God is the one who's testing and tempting Abraham, but in verse 11, it's an angel, or the angel of the Lord, called out to Abraham from heaven. Most people, most apologists would say this is not a big deal, and maybe it's not, because the angel of the Lord is generally viewed as being the mouthpiece of God. But I find it strange that just in a short period of verses, we change from God has decided to test Abraham to an angel of the Lord comes in to basically stop the test. That doesn't tell us that much, but it's interesting to me to see how this changes from I'm going to test you and an angel will stop you. Now, it's unlikely, given the broader context, that this angel is somehow violating God's commands. And it's probably safe to assume that this angel is in fact representing what God has to say. But if we're going to do that, if we're going to take this angel as the mouthpiece of God, then we have to look at what the angel actually says. And the angel says, "For now I know that thou fearest God." And it doesn't mean fear necessarily in the sense of being terrified. It's more about, respect. So let's talk a little bit about what is actually being tested here and what sort of proper responses to this test would we expect to see. So generally speaking, when we talk about the God of the Bible, the God that we're talking about in this Abraham and Isaac story, which would apply to Judaism, Christianity, and in the Quranic version would also apply to Islam, that God is all-knowing, omniscient. There's a lot of arguments and disagreement about what is meant by omniscient, and the word omniscient doesn't appear in the Bible. It's not there. It is basically extracted from the idea that God knows everything. But this isn't well defined in the Bible as to what God does or doesn't know. And so I remember as a kid, I would ask, well, if God knows everything, why is he testing Abraham? He already knows what's going to happen. He knows the number of hairs on my head. He has known from the beginning of time everything that was going to happen. And it turns out that my version of Christianity that I was raised with, the Southern Baptist tradition, or at least the portion that I got from my parents and my ministers, had a version of omniscience that probably didn't make any sense. There are other Christian traditions that say God's omniscience isn't truly omni, in much the same way that they would say that God is all-powerful in the sense that he has all power that is logically possible. He can't make a burrito so hot that he can't eat it. He can't violate logic. His omniscience is God knows all things that can be known. Now, when you hear something like this, the first thing you should realize is that they've told you absolutely nothing, because none of us know what is or isn't knowable. And so they're basically creating a loophole, an exit strategy, so that they can simultaneously claim that God is all-knowing and yet get around the problems where, well, hey, does God know the future? Well, we're not sure, because that might conflict with free will. Why would God test Abraham? Clearly, he knows what Abraham's going to do. He knows Abraham's heart. He knows what's in Abraham's mind. And so even if he had to prompt Abraham to think about something in order to be able to read his mind, pulling from science fiction, he could have just said, "Hey, Abraham, do you fear me? Do you respect me?" Boom, done. As soon as he thinks about it, you know it if you're able to read minds. So if those tests, which were easier and simpler, were available, this test doesn't make any sense. And if God knows everything and he knows what Abraham's going to do, then this test also doesn't make sense. And the apologetic that I was given as a child was, God isn't testing Abraham for God's benefit. God is testing Abraham for Abraham's benefit. He is showing Abraham that he, in fact, does actually fear and respect God, and that he is, in fact, willing to do whatever God commands, including sacrificing his son. I have a slightly different take on what is potentially being tested here, and I think that this makes a lot more sense. And it is absolutely damning to the idea that God is reasonable or all-knowing or testing anything. In order for God to be testing Abraham, whether he's doing it for his benefit or Abraham's benefit, the test must be, does Abraham's understanding of me make sense? Does my servant Abraham have the correct understanding of who I am, of my character, of what I would expect from him. This means that Abraham was rewarded for having a correct understanding of God. Abraham was venerated as the father of the Jewish race because his internal God model was accurate, and he was compelled to be respectful and fearful and true to the God that he knew and understood. And what that means is Abraham's model of God included the idea that God could and would ask for a sacrifice of a child. Christian apologists have forever been trying to argue that one of the key factors of the biblical God is that he was opposed to child sacrifice. And there are biblical passages that express this view, that those people who are sacrificing their children to Baal, they are evil, etc. But viewed in this light, it appears that the Hebrew God wasn't so much opposed to child sacrifice as he was opposed to child sacrifice to other gods. Because if you're God and you are vehemently opposed to child sacrifice, then it would never be part of your character to say to one of your servants, bring forth your child and sacrifice him to me. And if you wanted to test one of your servants to see if their internal understanding of who you were was accurate, and you went to them and you said, Abraham, I want you to grab your son and take him up to this mountain and make him a sacrifice to me, then the one and only correct answer from Abraham would be, I don't know who you are, but depart from me, because you are clearly not the God of love that I worship. You are clearly not my God. There is no way that a loving God would ask me to sacrifice my beloved child. You are a demon from the pit of hell. Depart from me, because you are not my God. That is the one and only correct answer if God is opposed to child sacrifice. But that's not the answer that was rewarded in this case. What was rewarded was obedience. What was rewarded was fearfulness and respect. What was rewarded was the idea that the God of the Bible could, would, and did demand a child sacrifice. This is the death knell of Christian apologetics that try to make God appear to be a loving, kind God who was opposed to child sacrifice. There simply is no way that I can see that God could, in fact, be opposed to child sacrifice, be a reasonable, loving God, and create as a test, either for his benefit or for the benefit of his servant, which demands a child sacrifice. This story appears in the Bible, it's in children's Bibles, it's in cartoons, and when you're in church, the sort of apologetics that you get related to this is the finest example of obedience, that one was willing to sacrifice even the person that they held most dear to God, because God is righteous, and anything that God demands, no matter how abhorrent it appears to us, it must be a good thing. And this is said from the same mouths that try to claim that their God is opposed to child sacrifice, that this is abhorrent, that this would be an evil thing. And that's why when I get in conversations with people about the morality of God, and I ask them, hey, if God demanded that you slaughter your kid, would that make it moral? On many occasions, they say yes. They are bound to say yes. And their excuse is, God understands better than we do. And therefore, yeah, it might seem repugnant to us that he wants us to slaughter a child as a sacrifice, but that child is going to go to heaven, and God has this plan, and we know it's all going to work out for his plan. And this manner of apologetic is, to me, indistinguishable from someone like Andrea Yates, who thinks that she should kill her children so that they don't reach an age where they could potentially go to hell. So they kill them while they're innocent, so they're guaranteed to go to hell. Even if it means damning myself to hell, that would be the ultimate sacrifice. It's not the ultimate sacrifice to give up your child. The ultimate sacrifice would be to damn yourself to hell to ensure that your children or other people got to experience paradise or heaven. There's just no way around this problem of the Abraham and Isaac story that I can see. There's a God demanding human sacrifice and rewarding people for thinking that's exactly what he would do. And yet people who worship this God only focus on the obedience and begin by assuming that because God is righteous, commands that we would in any other context view as morally repugnant are somehow good. This is one of the key moral failures of Christianity, and in this case of Judaism and Islam. Although the Islamic version is slightly better because the kid consents to being killed, as preposterous as that may sound. Let's all just obey the tyrant that is commanding our slaughter, because it's all going to work out for the good. How did you tell again that God was the good one and Satan was the evil one? I can't tell the difference sometimes.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.